Alright, are you guys ready to start? So thanks for coming out. Appreciate it. So for those of you who don't follow us on social media, here's where you can find us. We have a gorgeous website at Philly.rb.org. On Twitter, we have Philly.rb, where you can get the latest news from us. On IRC, it's pound Philly.rb, Philly.rb, on Freenode, and obviously you know about the meetup because you're here. And we have some videos on Vimeo, vimeo.com/Philly.rb. So we have some sponsors, Comcast, specifically Sim, pays for the room and the food. So we can drink, guys. I'm just kidding. Chariot, they pay for our meetup, and Top Lock who designed the site and the stickers and the logo. And tonight, Justin actually brought us water because we ran out of water. So thank you, Justin. Are you ready? Yeah. All right. So since Sim is a sponsor, they get an opportunity to talk for a little bit. And John Rivello will be giving us some announcements from Sim.
Yeah, so blame Mike for the missing water, but thanks, Justin, for getting us. So yeah, I'm John Rivello. I work at Comcast, and we provide the room and food. So if you're sitting next to someone that works at Comcast, you're probably happier than usual today because it's lab week. We get three to four of these per year, and that's when we take a week where we want to work on new stuff, different processes and work, we want to improve open source software, that kind of stuff. I'm working on some integration with critical CSS and Rails right now. That if that goes well, it'll help that. But also to make sure people are aware that we are always hiring pretty much at Comcast. I know right now there's a few accessibility positions open that we should do, and also just start breaking ground next door. You might have seen in a few years that will be our next great technology building. So if that interests you, come talk to me or anybody else at Comcast, and we're happy to talk about this vision.
So round of applause for Comcast. So the schedule for tonight will be announcements, lightning talks, if any of you want to give a lightning talk. Then the main talk, which is RSpec for Bauss, 2010. And then we're going to the bar, which is ladder 15. Hopefully it stops raining. So announcements. There's like a mini JavaScript conference happening on the 2 weekends from now called Liberty.js. It's libertyjs.com. If you're interested in Node or any of the JavaScript technologies like Angular, they'll be having classes and stuff. And I think it's $10 to enter. So libertyjs.com. So we will be having a speaker from Opscode, who is the creator of Chef, next month, and they'll also be running a Chef class soon. And they gave us a coupon code, which is just meetup for 10% off. They'll be posting that to Google Group soon.
That's it from the class going on today tomorrow?
Yes. You said it's coming. Is it at a Sears Center?
Yes.
I'm pretty sure it's a different class. So any other announcements?
You said a coupon code will be posted to the Google group?
Yeah, the Google Group.
Not meetup.com?
No.
I didn't know there was.
So, I did not. We do have a Google Group. It's a really long URL. Just Google Philly.rb Google Group. And every so often there are posts in there about certain things. If you follow us on Twitter already, you'll definitely see it. All right, any other announcements? No?
That's not really an announcement, but if anyone's gone to either Rowing to Ruby or Steel City Ruby, like the Twitter account, we'll try to follow a little bit.
Okay. So talk to Brian if you're going to Burlington Ruby Conference in Steel City. Yeah. So there's a new meetup in town. comments by this guy. I'm going to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, so starting a new meetup. It's called Software Ascraft Philadelphia. About a year and a half ago, I was looking for more conferences to go to, not just in the Ruby community. And I discovered SCNA, which is a software craftsmanship conference in Chicago. The next one will be in, I believe, spring of 2015. And it's really great. The whole idea of it is it's about being better developers, serving clients better. It's not really specific to one technology. So our first meetup is going to be the 29th. Frontworks is going to be hosting at their new office called Chestnut, and providing venue and food. Pam Selly will be speaking on identifying as a craftsman. And what we're going to try to do every month is have code katas or exercises. So bring your laptops. We're going to do like a pairing session. And some of the speakers in the future have expressed interest in actually incorporating that into their talk. So yeah, if you're interested in software craftsmanship, testing, software quality, last I checked, there were about 5 spots left for this month. But there's a waiting list, and we might open up a few more spots. And that's it. It'll be every month, last Tuesday. There. scphilly.org will redirect to the meetup site, or there's a Twitter account at sc_Philly.
All right, so does anyone have a lightning talk that they would like to give? No? You need the projector?
Yeah.
I have actually a dongle. I have a dongle. Are you going to get it? Sweet. Great. So my name is David Kinzer. I work at Technical Library as a lead developer. I know I gave a lightning talk last time. I'm not thinking of making a habit out of this, but I wrote a toy application in Ruby, and I wanted to share it real quick with you guys. So the application is called Commit, and it's just a funny sort of application that it's inspired by, I read this article a couple of weeks ago, maybe like a month ago, where this guy committed to his GitHub account and distributed the commits in such a way that he wrote some, like a name, something on his thing. So I thought that was kind of a fun thing to do, and I decided to write a script that does the same thing, but does it, in one fell swoop. So it takes advantage of the fact that you can actually name the date. You can when you create a commit, you can always add any kind of attributes you want to it. So you can change the date, who committed the message, so all kinds of things like that. And then it takes the other advantage that GitHub doesn't actually understand that, doesn't look for that. And so when you push things to GitHub, it will just assume that you're telling it the truth. So that's what this does. So it doesn't do anything useful. It's just kind of a funny, useless application. And then in terms of the code, I'm very proud of it because I got a code climate for the test coverage of 100%. So
but it doesn't, it's very simple, so it's always very easy to get good code quality when things are super simple. But the interesting things in terms of, here we are. There are like two interesting things. One of which was that I got to use the Ruby functional stuff that I learned the last time we were here, which is right here, this little bit right here. We're throwing a block of code, which is just a procedure, and then we're iterating and invoking that. So that's one cool thing. I've never used it, Ruby functionally that way. And the other thing that I found was that I needed to test. And by the way, I used mini tests to run these, so I know that RSpec is really cool, but mini test for me is it's very easy. I wanted to test that these functions return the right, the expected commands, but in order to run it, I didn't, in a test environment, I didn't want it to actually create the, to actually run Git, run the command, because in most cases it would just wipe out whatever I'm writing. As you can see here, that it says Git hard, and then it just kills everything that you work with. So that's not good to test it in your local environment. But I learned that you can actually override stuff like this, like with backtick inside a module, and you can override the usual effect of the command, and then just say, okay, just send me, instead of doing what the command does here, just send me a string of what the command is, and then you can test against that string. So that was, it's nothing truly smart, but I thought it was kind of neat that you can do that with Ruby. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Any other lightning talk speakers?
This is a talk in progress. I reserve the right to represent it. Just show up. Yes. See that? Okay now? Okay. All right. So this talk is about what happens when we call require in Ruby. So the first thing, require, is a method. You can see that in my IRB session. I call method require. I don't know if you're familiar with the method. It's pretty neat. What it returns is a method object that tells you that kernel is mixed in the object, and then that's the method right there, require. So you can call kernel.require. That's where it comes from. So where does require live? There's an awesome method on the method called source location that tells you where in Ruby source the actual method is written out where it's defined. Very usefully for require, that returns nil. So we're going to have to dig a little further. But that makes me sad. I wish it returns nil. So let's find the source anyway. This is what it looks like in JRuby, which is a real Ruby VM. Please use it. It's fast. It's a useful alternative. This is what the method looks like. Even if you know Java, this is going to look opaque. But what you can see is there's a method defined here called require 19. There aren't 18 requires before it. It's for requiring 19. The things that it takes are somewhat interesting. Thread context, which we'll talk about. The object they don't use ever. The name, which is the actual thing we're going to require. and a block which also doesn't get used. The context is a thread context, which gives us a runtime because you can run multiple VMs in JRuby, very interestingly. You need, if we'll see in the other implementations that all of them have some sort of thread checking inside. I'll talk a little bit about why. And then maybe further, you can see there's right here runtime get load service. That's where all the magic happens. That's where it actually loads Ruby code. This is what it looks like in Rubinius. It's a lot easier to read, at least to my eyes. Again, you can see it's synchronizing here. Again, so that's where it's dealing with threads. Rex is or REQS, that's a list of things that have already been required. One of the things that's interesting about require versus load is that it's the same stuff, except with require, it only happens once. So if you require the same thing 10 times, that code gets loaded once. If you do the same with load, it gets loaded 10 different times. Stuff in there might be interesting. Current thread, it waits on. It's not the current thread, it waits. Another thing I thought that was interesting was this comment here. The other thread doing the lock raised an exception through the require, so we try and load it again here. I don't really know what that refers to because the block ends right there. So this is what it looks like in MRI. God bless you if you can read this just by looking at it. You can also see it's getting a thread here. What else is interesting? I think that's also a little bit interesting. Yeah. But I think that's all I've got for MRI. Just that it's a talk in progress. I found this in the MRI source, which I also thought was interesting. Require libraries. Why here? It's so natural. Okay, and then finally, this is required inside of Ruby gems because once you require Ruby gems, it redefines require because it does stuff like changes load path and changes where to define stuff that should get required. Interesting. The activation monitor is, I believe, where it does its thread checking. It's also a lot longer of an implementation than the rest. I think just because it does a little bit more. But yeah, okay. So the common themes in require, stuff that it does, it finds files. So what's inside of load path and gem path to see, to actually find the text files to load. Loading code, evaluating Ruby, require passes that off to something else to do that. That's for a much longer talk. And MI in a thread does thread checking. Finding files, load path and gem path, I think are the interesting bits. I have a little Ruby code here that I just execute that just shows what your load path might look like. These are the places that will get checked if you require something. I put my gem path after that. That's also a list of places that will get checked for gems. The gem loading is just a little bit more complicated. It'll look in a few more places. I didn't actually know this. Require can load non-Ruby files. It can load compiled shared objects, so like C shared objects. It can also load DLLs, which is also surprising. JRuby cannot, but it can load jar files, which are better. So, load is so require is just load, but with a check to make sure that what you're loading hasn't been required yet. Possibly a more interesting talk would be like what happens when you load something, because there is a lot that happens there. You can dig pretty deep. But MI in a thread, that's interesting because, so what harm could it come from not synchronizing code loading? I mean, I think the most obvious is that require gives you this promise. If this has already been loaded, I'm not going to load it again. It'd be easy to break that promise if you did not synchronize, because you could have two threads. One of them says, hey, here's require. I want to require the can-can gem. And then you have another thread that says, hey, I also want to require the can-can gem. If they interleave in such a way that they haven't added to the list of gems that have already been required, then both of them will get loaded, and it'll get loaded twice. So it'll break that promise. what require doesn't do in Ruby, but other similar things do in other languages is it'd be nice to be able to require something with a different, like require something into a namespace or require it with a different name. Something that like Clojure and Python do. It's really useful. It helps prevent collisions. So for example here, I'm importing NetHTTP as something, and I'm importing the HTTP gem as the HTTP gem. So maybe I could use them together instead of colliding. That's it. That's me, Jay Winter on Twitter.
All right. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the talks. So now for our main speaker, Greg Sturvia, who will be talking about RSpec.
Lights.
You want lights?
Okay. It's kind of depressing part. Right. Craig, can you share your screen again? Sure. I'm plugging.
Good.
Yep, thanks.
We're trying Google Hangouts Live, is that what's called?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. With somebody in Japan. See how it works. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. My name's Greg. Thanks for the intro, Javon. My talk today is called Straight Up RSpec 3, a neat Ruby VDD tool. Extra points to anybody who catches all of the ridiculous drinking that I do during this. So my goal here is to kind of go beyond the basics a little bit of RSpec, offer some of my opinions, highlight some relatively new hotness, and talk a little bit about upgrading from RSpec 2 to RSpec 3. And briefly, just about me. I'm a software engineer at PromptWorks. I've been working with Ruby for over 7 years and RSpec for most of that. If you guys have questions at any point during this, please just stop me, raise your hand. I much prefer that this is interactive rather than me talking at you. So let me know if anything's not clear or if you want me to repeat something, or like I said, if you got any questions. All right, so a little more about what we're going to go through today. I'm going to talk about organization of your spec files. I'm going to talk about running specs, configuring them, and then kind of the meat of this is going to be a little refactoring exercise where I'm going to upgrade a little spec library here, and then I'll reference and give you some links to some additional things you guys might find interesting. All right, so first, organization. How many people here have used RSpec before? And how many people have not? Few, okay, cool. Those of you who have not have used other test unit frameworks, even in other languages? Yeah, okay, cool. So for most of you, this will be familiar. This is, listing the contents of a directory that you might have as your project. You may have a dot file there that is some configuration for RSpec. You've got your lib there with the implementation, and then you'll have some spec directory here with a spec helper. And you may also have some support files for your test suite. It's pretty common practice to put those under support. Some people even name them in further directories like matchers, examples, etc. And then you might have some spec files. In this little trivial example, I have a Martini spec. I didn't bother splitting it up into unit and integration and other such tests here, but you might have that directory structure as well. So the spec helper itself can and should be pretty slim. All I'm doing here is requiring my implementation. It's a little library called Barkeep. And then I iterate through all the files in my support directory for spec and require those. And this is nice to keep this slim, because as you upgrade RSpec, you can rerun like RSpec init and overwrite this file if you need to and make minimal changes. You can always move configuration-specific things into your spec support directory into individual files. Makes it easier to find. All right, running specs. RSpec, the spec runner in RSpec is pretty excellent. Gives you a lot of different options. I'm going to go through a few of them. And these are things that you can specify, at runtime when you type RSpec. You can specify some flags there. Or if you prefer using rake, you can put these things into a dot file in your project, and the rake task will respect those. Here's an example of a .RSpec dot file. I'm saying I want things in color, show me some warnings, and oh yeah, I require my spec. And this is a file that you're going to commit to your code repository and share with your team, something that everybody's going to use. RSpec 3 introduces the RSpec local dot file. And the idea here is it's something that you'd ignore in your version control system, and it's something unique to you, whatever your personal preference is. In this example, maybe I'd like to see this very verbose formatting where I see all the text that I've entered for my examples, and give me a full backtrace when things fail. This is not actually mine. Yeah?
So since it has a local file, does RSpec have options to turn options off that might be specified in local, or does one override the other?
I believe the local will override the .RSpec one. But I have not
completely, or just parts, do you know? Like,
I think if I were to specify a format in my .local that is different than a format I specified in just the .RSpec, then my local would win.
Right.
Okay. I think if you like specify dash color, I think there's like a no color option. So I think they usually have to override. Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go flip through some quick examples here of running RSpec and some of the things you can do with it. RSpec 3 has removed support for the line number argument here in favor of this colon. So you can see here I am running 2 different lines in one spec file here, line 15 and 22. And those could be an example, or it could be a group of examples that you want to run. I mentioned before formatting. You can format this documentation format. It's nice and verbose and readable, as opposed to the default progress thing where you see a bunch of dots fly by. There's also fail fast, which is something that I'm a fan of. If you want to run your test suite and you think, hey, I think everything's been working just fine here, I'm just going to run it real quick. If something fails, I want to know about it right away so I can start fixing it. Fail fast is the tool you want to use. If it does run into a failure, it'll stop right there, give you the report of what failed, and exit. So you can start working on it. You can also target specific tags in RSpec. A tag is basically metadata that you can put on any example or group of examples. Here I might have a tag named JS. Maybe these are some feature specs that I'm running on a Rails project, and I actually want to run JavaScript. And what this command will do is run just those examples that are flagged as such. And here the value of that tag would be true. And they can be any value you want. It could be a string. I can say if I tag things as Ruby 2.1, then I could run just those things. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Next, RSpec will profile your test runs for you. This is helpful if you're trying to speed up things in your test suite. It'll show you the 10 slowest things. This is nice to track over time if you use continuous integration. Something like that. Another nice thing that RSpec gives you is running your test suite in a random order. Does anybody run into bugs where they have interfering tests that fail sometimes? Yeah. Using this order random, it will surface those problems sooner at some time. You'll notice here that this would be the bottom of the test run. There is a randomized with seed, and it gives you a number. That number is important. If you see a failure there, and you say, wait, why does my test suite fail only sometimes? You can take that number and rerun your test suite in the same order, again, using it like this, to recreate that same failure, hopefully. Focus. Focus is a commonly used tag to run a specific example or group of examples. You can see I've used the tag here for it should have ingredients. And by default in RSpec, if you just put a symbol, like I have here, the value of that tag is true. Also in RSpec 3, they give you a shortcut to that if typing FOCUS is too long. You can put an F in front of it. You can also put an F in front of describe or context if you want to run just those blocks or examples quickly. This might be something you're working on at the moment. You don't need to run the whole test suite. Use it.
I have a question about random.
Yeah.
So if you have the random runs, let's say in a Travis build, and your test fails, can you then run it onto a local machine versus the Travis virtual machine, and have it run the same order?
Yes. So yeah, the focusing on specific examples or groups of examples like this is really helpful if you're using something like guard to continually run your test suite. You can have it focus on just. Similarly, RSpec 3 introduces skip. And as you might imagine, it doesn't run this example. And they also give you xit and xdescribe and xcontext as a quick way to skip a group of examples or an example that's running. And those of you who've been using RSpec for a while say, well, I thought that's what pending was. Pending in RSpec 3 is a little different. Pending, if you mark an example as such, will actually run that example. And if that example passes, like if the expectation is met, then it's a test failure. Because you flag this thing as pending, you're expecting it to fail. This is a bit of a departure, so if you have some ugly leftover pending things sitting in your test suite, you might notice a test failure when you go to upgrade it. Yeah?
Yeah, so going back to X.
Yes?
Is there an indication that will tell me that, hey, you have some stuff that you're Xing out and you need to go back and make sure you take care of those?
Great question. Yes, I believe that is output in the test run. Yeah, you might actually want to do something like set up a pre-commit hook in Git if you use Git to check for these types of things so they don't make it into master where they're shared.
I think actually that accounts them as pending tests.
Say the last part again.
It's strange that I do like pending option that would farm X out. Like describe your hits as pending tests and then not pending. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess you're saying that it's
a report that runs at the end of RSpec.
Yeah.
You have X out tests. It says they're pending.
Okay, but it didn't cause a failure or
No.
Okay, so the confusion with the term pending.
Yeah, it seems like the terminology is not.
Yeah. That change to skip from pending was recent in RSpec 3. I wonder if they just didn't catch the test output. Okay, so if you do want to skip something, mark it as skip instead of pending now. They're two different beasts. All right, talk a little bit about configuring RSpec. RSpec allows you to configure a lot of different things, like including modules that you might use in your tests, like matchers or other helper methods. You can do so using metadata. In one of the examples up on the screen right now, model helpers would only be included for examples that match that metadata. The type is model. This might look familiar to you if you use RSpec Rails. RSpec also allows you to do test setup in a few different ways and teardown. In the past, in RSpec 2, you've probably used before each, and before all, and maybe even before suite. There are new names for these things because before all, before each was a little confusing for some folks. They've given us before context and before example as new things in RSpec 3 to try and be a little bit clear about when things are going to be run. And I urge you to beware of before suite and before context, and not just in your configuration here, but in any spec file where you use those things, especially suite, because that will be run before your entire test suite. It kind of opens you up, if you aren't careful, for interacting tests or generous leftovers, whatever you want to call them. So, has anybody been bitten by that, using or overusing that? Me too. So, inclusion, I talked about this a little bit earlier with tags. And in this example, I'm saying, hey, we're going to use the focus tag. We're going to filter our run whenever we see the focus tag and the value is true. And then the next line after that, run all when everything is filtered. That means if there is no focus tag on anything, just run the entire suite, which is what often happens when you run your test suite.
Do you have to, the first block you have up there, do you have to specify that if you want that focus?
The focus feature? Yes. Yeah. I'm not sure, but I think that RSpec may give you a commented out version of this when you run RSpec init. They'll generate a spec helper file for you with a lot of helpful clues and hints about how you might want to configure your test suite. Somebody else might be able to confirm. Conversely, you can exclude things. In this example, I'm looking for a tag called Ruby, and then looking at the constant Ruby_version, and excluding things that don't match, excluding examples that don't match the current Ruby. So if any of you work on open source projects and have to support various versions of Ruby, you need to test for those things specifically, this might be a helpful tool. All right, on to something a little bit more interesting and exciting here. This is a simple, goofy little code library that's made solely for the purposes of illustrating some RSpec hotness. There's a URL right up there. If you guys want, you can follow along, check it out, and go through this shortly. Anybody need me to leave it up there any longer? So to start off, I'm going to look at this spec file. This is my Martini spec. This is what you might see in version 2. Probably seen specs like this at some point. There are some opportunities here for improvement, and we're going to upgrade this as well. So the upgrade process has been made pretty easy by the contributors at RSpec. They've got some great step-by-step instructions, and I'll share a URL with you for that. They've also created a version of RSpec, which is 2.99, that you should inventory, install, and run your test suite with before upgrading. What that does is issue deprecation warnings for almost everything that changes in RSpec 3. So your test suite should run and pass successfully, but you'll get all kinds of helpful deprecation warnings about things that you might need to change as you're upgrading to RSpec 3. On top of that, somebody else created a magical tool for converting your specs to the latest RSpec syntax. And this is a static analysis tool that will go through, parse your spec library and update it automatically for you. And it does a pretty good job of doing that. When I tried it out, it missed a couple things, but largely took care of the really tedious text changes, like changing should to expect, which has to happen often. And that library is called RSpec. I'll share a URL with you guys shortly. So here is what that same spec might look like in RSpec 3. You'll notice that there is no more should. We're using expect. This has been around for a little while now, but should is officially deprecated, and you'll get warnings all over the place if you use it. So some of you might ask why this change has happened. This is because in order to implement should, RSpec polluted the global namespace and added methods to object in order to get that to work. Another word for this is monkey patching. So RSpec wanted to move away from that. The authors wanted to move away from doing that. And so they've introduced this new expect syntax. And you'll see up here, I'm saying I expect Martini, my instance variable, to respond to a few different methods. That's it. Oh, one other thing I wanted to note about monkey patching. The authors of RSpec also did something pretty remarkable. They gave us an option now to disable every single monkey patch they have in RSpec. The only real trade-off there is that you need to prefix some of the DSL with RSpec. So it would be rspec.describe in this example.
Monkey patching.
Monkey patching was what I just was talking about with the polluting of the global namespace, where they are defining methods on object that are available everywhere.
Can you define what monkey patching is?
That's what I was attempting to do there. If anybody's got a better way to say that.
So by patching the class to the global namespace or the global object like he describes, it inherently affects everything that is calling an object in the runtime. Right. Right, even if it's right in the middle of something that's already been instantiated, if it's been monkey patched in the runtime, that object that has been instantiated automatically receives the monkey patch.
And the key there is you have those classes, so you can add that to the string object and no one's going to know it.
Yes, so every single instance defined would, in RSpec 2, have a .should method. So if you wanted to use that for your own purposes, you'd be out of luck.
Wikipedia article if you want to read more about monkey patching. Google that term.
So I'm going to take a stab at refactoring that spec now to make it a little more readable and maybe a little less repetitive. So I'm going to create this custom matcher, which is something that RSpec allows us to do. They even give us a handy little DSL to do so. And you can create them from scratch as well, defining your own classes. You don't have to use their DSL. But in this example, it's very easy. So what I've done here is called their define method. And I'm going to name my matcher have attribute. And it's going to get, I'll define a block. And to that block, we pass a name, so I'm going to call it. And there is a match method that I call. And that will get the target of the test. And I'm going to say basically that target, whatever object that is, should respond to a getter and a setter. So that could be garnish and garnish equals, for example. I'll show you how we use that. Here we go. So instead of having the repetitive expect Martini to respond to booze and expect Martini to respond to booze equals, we can now just say expect Martini to have attribute, booze. So removed a couple of lines here. Feels pretty good. I had to include my attribute matchers. You see that line there below describe. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Anybody here use custom matchers in their test suites? Oops.
I have a quick question about that before. What is the default to example or context?
Example. Meaning that the block that I passed you before will be called for every example. The RSpec 2 term was each. So in RSpec 2, they introduced subject here. And instead of having that instance variable that I call all over the place, I can define what the subject of my test is. In this case, it's my new martini. And I say I expect subject to have attribute booze. I should note, too, that RSpec 3 allows you to, if you define subject, you can actually call super now in the block for subject. If you've used that before. So it can be pretty powerful, but in thinking about it, I've only thought of a couple cases where you might actually want to do that. There are better patterns. It's available. And same thing, you can do the same in let. If for some reason you had nested contexts and you define let in multiple places, you could actually call super. But again, I have a hard time thinking of a good use case. So RSpec 3 also introduced the named subject. Here I've named it martini. So instead of calling it subject throughout my test, I can call it martini. It's a bit more descriptive, it reads better, it's more obvious what I'm testing in my examples. In this specific case, you can see the whole test here on one slide. But in other test suites, you might have a big, large context, and you may not be able to see exactly what subject is when you're reading a given example.
Does that behave differently from let, the subject?
How so?
Well, it looks a lot like let.
It is a lot like let.
Is it different, or is it just that?
You can call it subject and reference it as such in your examples, like so. And there's one other magic case, which I'll show you in a minute, about why it's different. But basically, it's a memoized function. If you call it multiple times, it's only going to be, the block for subject will only be executed once. Memoized. Okay. So, name subject. Yeah, so some people argued that having subject without a name was a smell. It was hard to read and remember what subject was when you're dealing with large contexts. And like I said, I think when you do have a large context, naming your subject makes a lot of sense. And an example like this might be overkill. I'll leave that as an exercise to you, the attendee, to determine. And in this example, I'm going to talk about the implicit subject. So right here, you might notice that in my examples, I'm saying is expected to have. I no longer say expect subject to have. So this gets a little bit shorter. And I think we can make it even better. This is one of those magic things that subjects gives us. We can remove those redundant it messages because RSpec, the DSL, is quite readable itself. Cleaning up more lines of code here. Any questions on this?
You go back to that slide.
Sure.
See the difference again. Oh. Okay, I see what you're saying.
So basically, I remove the text.
Yeah, so you changed the block syntax.
Yep, and I remove the do end, and it's just curly braces now. Sure.
I guess in some ways we kind of depend on that text to show up when we run RSpec, what shows up.
A very readable version of this. RSpec is smart enough to output something that looks much like as you read it right now in the code.
There's a resemblance to that there now, you just don't put it in.
I'm sorry?
So the opposite bears a resemblance to what's there now, just you don't have to write it out.
Yes. So I talked about the implicit subject, meaning the subject is implied. There's also a derived subject. You'll notice here, I'm not even defining what the subject is. RSpec will look at your describe block, and if you have a class there, it will just instantiate it. You get it for free. And this is another one of those cases where you're not being explicit enough in what this might say. And my opinion is, in a spec that's this small, it doesn't matter. You can read it, it's all right there. If you know how RSpec works. But in a case where you want to be more explicit and communicate to other developers what you're doing, maybe defining a subject, even if it's redundant, might be approved. So we still have this include attributes matchers here. You know what? I'm going to use this in other places. I think I'll just configure my test suite to include it. Here, I'm just including it on all specs, but I could have filtered that if I wanted to using metadata like these tags. Yeah? You got it.
So it's worth noting that if you pass a class to describe, it will call a new one with no parameters. So if you constructor takes parameters, it will
That's a great point. Yep. You're not passing anything here. And I think in a case where you do have to pass something to it, it's probably worth defining what subject is to begin with. But great point. Thanks. There are some test libraries I've seen, I guess JavaScript being the only one, but where in your describe, you can actually define what those parameters are and what the class is that you want to instantiate. And you never ever define what subject is. It's a little bit too magic for me, but there are other testing libraries that do that. So I'm going to include my attribute matchers in all my specs, because I think I'm going to reuse them. And now I don't have to do it in my individual test file. So here's what my new 3.0 refactor test might look like. Basically, 4 lines of code as compared to the original 2.0 unfactored spec. I argue it's a little bit more readable and syntactically a little bit prettier.
Some of the things that you're showing are available in the 2x branch right now, right? In anticipation of 3x.
Oh yeah.
Is everything available? If you're on Linux?
I'm trying to flag those things that are specific to 3 as I go through, but I might miss it. But a lot of these things have been added to 2 in pieces. Yeah. Later versions of 2.
I don't think that is expected on 2.
I think you're right. Yeah.
But you can probably do some shit. Very good.
Yeah, is expected is nice for these one-liners in particular. You feel like that sometimes.
So if you were to write a helper in RSpec 2, and this is just hypothetical because I don't actually program it, but in the helper, is there something akin to with Ruby, using the Ruby tag to specify the version? Is there an RSpec tag to specify which version of RSpec that helper is supposed to be running against? So that your test can be compatible with both 2 and 3, for example?
Right. I think you could do that if you really wanted to. I think if you had to do that, I would use the old syntax and suffer the deprecation warnings or disable.
In Ruby, I mean, in RSpec 2, I don't know what version, this one-liner syntax works as well, except it is should instead of is. it should have multiple.
All right, so I'm going to introduce a new spec for a new class called Whiskey. And this looks pretty familiar to my Martini spec that I had before. And you know what? I'm going to add some new requirements for my Martini class. Let's say it's got a glass and a garnish attribute as well. There's a lot of overlap between these two specs. Just like if you were to see an implementation and you notice a lot of overlap, maybe it's time to dry things up. Again, this is a bit contrived. I apologize, but in order to fit things on a slide here, I have to get a little short. So, enter a shared example group. This is a way for you to share examples across different spec files, probably for different classes or modules that you want to test. And wrap them in shared examples for, and I give it a name. Called it a drink in this case. And note that I'm not using instance variables here. We're going to rely on the subject of the test, be it implicit, derived, otherwise. 3 is shared context. I'm not going to show you an example, but the concept is exactly the same, where you can share test setup across examples and groups of examples. So let's look at that whiskey spec that I had before. Instead of having the 2 examples, I can say, hey, it behaves like a drink. And when I run this test, it's going to execute those 2 examples in my shared example group. Similarly, there's a include examples call, similar to it behaves like. There's a subtle difference between the 2. This is introduced in 3, I believe, as well. The include examples will run in the current context, whereas the shared it behaves like will be executed in a nested context. So if you're doing some monkeying around with context there, something to do. Okay, so let's look back at the Martini spec. Martini can use that same shared example group and say it behaves like a drink. And then I can go through and define any other examples that I need to that are specific to Martini class and maybe don't apply to whiskey. So let's go on and add some more features to both whiskey and Martini. I say it's going to have ingredients, and I'm going to make some expectations about that. So here's a place where I thought maybe you might call super in a subject definition. Again, this is still a bit of a stretch for me, but might be a good use case. I'm going to say, hey, the ingredients should be an array, and expect that it's going to have some ingredients. There's another new thing in RSpec 3 here where you can pass arguments to a shared example group. I don't believe you could do this in 2. So this is pretty cool. I found myself watching this a couple times and having to dance around it with a lot of lefts.
Do you think you can do it in 2?
You could.
Whatever version.
Okay, cool. Good to me. So I'll show you how I call that right here. I say it behaves like a drink, and then I say one of its ingredients is going to be vodka. Any questions about that? That's the shared example group again.
Do you have any advice on shared examples? Like, when is it overdoing it? When are you? Yeah.
Right. There's kind of the how many times are you repeating yourself question. Twice, probably not worth it, to refactor it. And probably depends on how many examples are in there. So, yeah, I think it's really up to you and your team to decide what that is. But, yeah.
Cases with modules. It can, if you run them with every place you include it, you can ensure that you're not clobbering that by accident. So that's a really good example of where you use it.
You will find people who are passionately religiously against them. And one of the reasons why they hate them is that they can be very hard to debug. Like the stack trace just doesn't say like, yeah, right here it'll tell you some other place where, like for example on the last if block, it's really hard to narrow it down. I don't know if they improved that. Great if they did.
I believe it tells you, originally called from in the test output.
That's
when I was
improvement.
at this point. Yeah.
And what's the last time they were expected to include ingredients for the testing there?
So that's saying, so I'm using the term ingredients probably too much here to make this confusing for you guys. The subject of the test is whatever the ingredients method on subject returns. In this case, it's an array. And the include matcher is just going to say that array should include some other elements, right? And that splat ingredients comes from right after the do block there. That's what I'm passing into this shared example. The splat operator will expand an array into arguments to be passed to a method. That's what the splat is. Yeah?
And this is just a normal moving block, so you can pass a name parameter. So go back to your other slide, it just said a drink and vodka, like if you wanted to name vodka ingredients.
Sure.
You can do that, and then in the actual shared example, you can reference it by
Another thing with shared examples, you can just find them in some other file, like maybe a support file or something like that. My shared examples go here. But some people really hate that because that makes it even harder to find than they were already hard to find before because they weren't the same file. So watch out for that too.
Yeah, if you're only using them in one spec file, it makes sense to put them in that spec file. If you have to share them across files, put them somewhere. All right, so let's talk about context. So here's my martini. I'm going to give it some context and say, oh, we're going to give it a mixer. We'll set the mixer, and then we'll make some more expectations about its ingredients. So introducing let, we've talked about that before. This is an RSpec 2 thing. And let lets you name things, and you can use this in place of things like instance variables. Again, this is a memoized function. You can think of it as such. And I'm going to say my mixer is vermouth, and I can reference it throughout my examples. There is a gotcha with let, and if we have time, I'll talk about it a little bit later. It's is another RSpec 2 thing. And it's been pulled out to a separate gem for RSpec 3. The gem is called RSpec its. So again, it's one of those things, there's some division in the RSpec world about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So if you like it, just inventory the gem, and you can use it. Its. And if you don't, sorry. So in this example here, I'm saying that the subject is going to continue to be my new instance of martini, and I'm going to call the ingredients method on it. That's what it does. I can set my expectation. I'll look back at what it was before. Makes things a little bit more readable. Shortens it up again. Anybody like its? Anybody dislike its? Right. I implemented that in RSpec 2. I took notes. Okay, so another alternative here with this implementation is breaking that up into a separate describe block, as I've done, instead of having that context that was there before. Arguably, this is a little bit more readable, and that would depend on the complexity of what you're testing there, whether you're going to use nested contexts a lot or not.
the question about its.
Sure.
If you pass arguments to that function or
I don't think so. I wouldn't advise doing it.
okay. So the ingredients that
I'm assuming ingredients is not a function that belongs to like its ingredients, or is it just not attributes?
Ingredients is a method defined on subject.
So that method needs arguments in order to run. How do you run it? You like pass it just like its ingredients.
So I've never attempted to do that. I don't know if you can, but again, I wouldn't try to do that. I think that would kind of obscure what you're trying to do. You can, if your subject is a hash or a thing that responds to the bracket method, you can put that symbol inside square brackets, and it will get the value of that key.
Well, I think that my question is, if the method ingredients requires for to be passed in some kind of an argument, you don't use its to.
I don't.
Okay.
And I don't even know if you can. Okay. That's a good question. Does anybody know? If you can, it would be a newer addition to its. Another thing to note here is just convention, but in my describe there, as I split up that context into a separate describe block, I said that the thing I'm describing is my Martini class, and then I have a little string there giving a little bit more context, for lack of a better word. And I use .new. The dot is a convention that we use to describe class methods, as opposed to a pound sign you use to describe instance methods. This does nothing functionally for you. It's just for us as we read through the code. This is a common convention. All right, so here's some more sugar for you, if you like it. We're using these collection cardinality matchers, they're called. This last example here we have is expected to have 1 items. There's a bit of sugar there. That word items can be any word you want here in this example. In RSpec 3, they pulled this out into a separate gem as well. I don't typically use these things, but if you like them and you use them, it's just a separate gem you've got to include to do this. You also have the ability, if you use it, to do something like this, where you can say it is expected to have 1.ingredients, and it will actually call that method on the subject. It's a little hard to grasp what's going on here, I think, when you read this. So I'm not typically a fan. Anybody like this or use this? So RSpec 3 gives a little bit more clarity into what's going on when you're matching arrays. We've seen the include thing before in my example. When you take an array, as my subject is here, and you use the include matcher, the order of what you specify afterward just doesn't matter. What's happening? The HDMI cable. And there is also the contain exactly matcher, which is subtly different in that order matters, and you have to have all the elements. There are aliases for these methods as well, but I think these are probably the best syntactically to read and understand what is going on, as opposed to match array or match, just match. We also have start with and end with matchers here. If you find yourself testing the first and the last element of arrays, this is common, or any enumerable, really. There's also the all matcher, which is really handy, and you can specify matchers to it. And it will verify that all of the elements in a given array meet the expectation that you set. So in this case, everything here has got to be a string, and everything here has to start with a word character. which leads me to something new in RSpec 3, which is the compound matchers. So here, I've combined the last two examples into one. Arguably, this is more readable. You can say, I expect that all of those elements are a string, and they start with a word character. That ampersand is the and part there. You can use .and instead of the ampersand. RSpec 3 also gives you or and pipe to use, though I don't know when or why you would want to have that kind of conditional logic, the or specifically, in your tests. Anybody find this more readable than having two examples like this?
Can you change the way it says it is expected to all, so it all is expected to be a string, or it doesn't work like that?
You have to keep the is expected to.
Is there a way to specify it without the trailing backslash there?
Not on a slide. Yes, it can be all one line, absolutely. That would help. Yeah, apologies for my white space.
Well, even if you wanted to make it multi-line, how would you do that without the backslash? Because I was working with training recently.
Yeah. Friends.
In the previous way, there's two expectations. You get two good error messages. What does the error message look like in one of these codes?
Good question. It is actually pretty readable, and it will tell you which one failed.
RSpec 2, you know, they said that you still do that single line implementation. So could you readable readout or something like that? So it's pretty good.
Yep. Yeah, really, that one-line syntax is just omitting the text that you're using to describe the example, and you change do end to curly brackets to define the block. So it's not actually a new method or anything, it's just omitting the overwritten example description. Cool. So RSpec 3 also gives us composable matchers in addition to compound matchers. And in this case, it's passing matchers to matchers, right? So here we have, it's expected to match, and the first element should start with the word character, and the second element should look like olive or olives here. Pretty powerful stuff. You can nest this ad nauseum. Might be helpful if you have a hash with a lot of different nested things in it, and you don't want to have to go through and define a subject for each of the keys that you have in the hash. I can see that being valuable here. So RSpec 3 has built-in support for composing matchers. In other words, passing matchers to matchers for most of their built-in matchers. But not all of them, because some of them it really doesn't apply, like EQ or equal just really wouldn't make sense to pass. So here is the same thing, just a little bit more verbose, although maybe a little bit more readable in the code here. They give us aliases for the matchers that I've used, where we say a string starting with, or a string matching. And they've done this again for the built-in matchers that they've got with RSpec 3. So, and it's generally worded like a underscore class name underscore matcher name, you know, starting with matching, including, etc. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about test doubles. How many people here use test doubles regularly in their test suites? About half? Cool. Okay. Anybody adamantly opposed to using test doubles in tests? Okay, great question. Okay. I think I'm going to illustrate some of that right here, so I'll go through and talk If you don't know what it is, then you probably never use one. Maybe you'll learn about it today. So, this example, I'm describing a terminal, something at a restaurant maybe. A terminal has a printer method. You know, terminal's going to talk to a printer and print out receipts or something. And I do some test setup here where I have a Epson. That's going to be my fixture here. It's just a dumb object. That's all it is. And in RSpec 2, you might say stub or mock. And I gave you the double method. Well, in RSpec 3, you have to call double. No more stub, no more mock, because people getting tripped up and confused on what that was. So the idea here is that in the setup for this test in before, I'm stubbing a method on printer. If it receives by IP, it should return my Epson test double. And then I run my test and I set an expectation that, hey, it should be Epson. Any questions on what's going on here? Anybody new to test doubles that doesn't know what's happening? Okay.
So this is a mock.
This is a stub because I'm not setting an expectation about whether that message is ever received. I'm just stubbing the response. I don't say, hey, it should have been called or it should be called. I just say, hey, if it gets that method call, then return this thing.
Is it like allow?
Boy, you're way ahead. That's all right. Teeing me up. So, RSpec 3. We can say allow printer to receive messages. And then you specify what those messages in the response are. This may have been introduced later in RSpec 2 as well. You can see that I'm saying Epson is double now, not a stub. That's the method I'm calling. And I'm saying I allow the printer class to receive some message and return that response. So doing the same exact thing. One term that I learned here when preparing this was that they call this practice of what I'm doing here a partial stub. Makes a lot of sense. Printer is an existing class. It's not some test double. And I'm just stubbing one method on it instead of defining some dumb object. So it's called a partial stub. And again, this reasoning for using allow instead of calling .stub is we don't want to be polluting that global namespace and defining the stub method on every single object. So one of the really cool things here that we have now that you used to have to lean on for this and prior versions of RSpec is double checking TM, my term. There's a library called RSpec Fire. Is anybody familiar with that? You know what that was? So what's happening in this example here is I have said I'm going to allow my printer class to receive some message by ID, and whoops, that was the wrong thing. I typed the wrong thing. That's not even a real method on that class. I could get a false positive in this if I run this test, and I could say, oh wow, my test passed, and I really didn't do what I thought I was doing with my test. It's easy to do with testing, with test doubles specifically. So now with RSpec 3, if my printer class does not define that method, then it will fail. And it will even check arguments passed to that method, or that you try to pass to that method. And if the method signature doesn't match, then it will fail. So this is pretty cool in that it mitigates one of the kind of biggest liabilities that the mockist TDD approach has, in that you can have passing test suite and you've never implemented a thing in your code. So there are some helpful methods that RSpec 3 gives us, instance double, class double, object double, and then you can also do this partial stubbing like I've done here. And to do this partial stubbing and make sure that it verifies that the method exists on the real object you have, you do need to configure RSpec to do so. It's just a one-liner, verify partial doubles equals true. If you guys are interested and motivated, just look it up on Ruby doc. Any questions about this? Yeah.
Is there an equivalent for like allow any instance of printer? Or...
Yes. Any instance. So in RSpec 2, if you wanted to specify some expectation here, where we have a mock, I'm saying my printer class should receive a specific message, and then when it does, with this exact parameter, return some fixture here. And what this kind of leads to is additional assertions in every test run. So what's going to happen here is there's one assertion in my before block, and then there's the assertion that's happening in my example it. This is kind of a test mill. You're testing two things in one test run. So then, yeah, if I had more more examples there, every time we would be running both assertions. So in the past, we had to rely on other libraries to give us things like test spies. And now in RSpec 3, we get those. You can see in this example here, change things around a little bit to make them fit on one slide. But the biggest, most important thing here is I'm saying allow my printer class to receive messages, IP, return Epson. And then I have two examples happening here. I have my legacy one that just says, hey, it should be Epson. And then I also have another one here that says, hey, it should have found the printer by its IP address. And what I'm testing there is that the printer class actually received the message that I wanted it to with the right arguments. So I can specify my expectation in the proper phase of the test, and not in the test setup that's not getting run every time. Any questions about what I just said? All right. One subtle thing that I did here, again, to get this to kind of fit on the slide, was I said subject bang. And subject bang will ensure that that method gets called with every run, even though I don't explicitly call it, or even implicitly call it. It will be run. There is a let bang also, for those of you. So the reason I needed to do that in this example here is if I didn't say subject bang, terminal.printer would never get called, and my printer class would never receive that message that I'm making the assertion about. And that last example would fail. All right, so any other questions about this?
Can you repeat that again? So
Sure.
Who's the bang?
Yeah.
What is it for?
Subject bang will call that block, even if before my examples are run. Even though I don't ever say subject, my examples will get called.
With the bang. Without the bang, it doesn't get called.
Only if you don't. Which you do in most cases. So I will show you. I'll open up my text editor. So,
It is going to call that first one, implicit, because it is expected to call the first.
In the first one, but not.
The problem comes in the second one, when it doesn't expect the class to receive the message. So
There's no exercise, right, in the second one. I don't ever exercise the subject. Yeah.
If you had two examples, would it call subject twice?
Yes. And I do have two examples.
I have another question about doubles. It's confusing me.
Yeah.
What's the difference between saying that Epson, and then the block has just the string Epson 5000 using double?
I could use that string. Totally right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm not really doing anything with that. I'm not setting anything. Yeah. This is more to illustrate that instead of calling stub or mock to create a mock object, that test double. All right. Any other questions about this? So I promised you guys a few links. Here are some of the libraries I mentioned. Those collection matchers, if you like those that have some number of elements, for example. RSpec Rails, also got some updates here. I didn't talk about them much today. One thing of note, there were some active model helper methods that were defined in RSpec Rails, specifically mock model. If you guys have used that, it's in a new library separate from RSpec Rails. And what that does is give you a test double that stubs many of the methods in a Rails model. Also talked about some of those step-by-step guides to upgrading. If you have a 2.x library and you want to go to 3, they did a wonderful job of updating the API documentation on RSpec. It was pretty abysmal before, and it's wonderful now, all kinds of examples. And this is separate from those features that you see on Relish. I don't know if you guys have looked at that, but they're two different things. So I encourage you to check out the rubydoc.info. Documentation is great now. And they still have the good documentation, and those are actually their Cucumber features on, I think it's Relish. Yeah, Relish now. Check out both. Additionally, there's that RSpec library that I mentioned that will convert your 2 to 3 magically. Yeah, for me, it works fairly well. And then there's also Myron Marston's blog. He's got some wonderfully written posts up there. He is the maintainer of RSpec now. So definitely worth a read there. He talks in depth about some of the reasoning behind pulling some of these things out of RSpec and using expect instead of should, and other interesting topics. Anybody else know any other good RSpec resources we're talking about? Better specs. What's that? Better specs. Better specs? Okay.
Shoulda matchers?
Shoulda matchers, the thought man, sure. Yep, have there been any new additions to that, given any of the new compound and composite?
You just have to wait.
All right. Cool. Shoulda matchers, Rails centric? It's almost all Rails stuff, isn't it?
Active model, active directory, active controller. It's mostly Rails, yeah, but active model, I guess.
Awesome. So Shoulda used to be a test library of its own, and now is matchers that you can use in RSpec for testing with Rails stuff. A lot of handy stuff. Validation stuff, I remember using.
Validation, a lot of stuff, controllers and filters, callbacks. It's a great place to look if you want to define your own matcher that doesn't use the RSpec DSL. Any object that responds to matches with a question mark and takes an argument. Yeah, it's all open source to figure out.
Yeah, I think you need to define failure message as well, so it knows what to put in it. Yeah, it's a very small footprint that you need.
Yeah, there's a couple methods that you need.
Okay.
You're going to post your presentation somewhere so that I can access these links as opposed to creating a that you can download on screen.
I will be there in just a minute. All right, well, cheers, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience with me. If you'll indulge me for a minute, talk about prompt work, where I work. We're a 12-person software consulting shop here in Philly. We just opened up a new office on Chestnut Street. We work with Fortune 100 companies and startups alike. So we work on hard, exciting projects. Today we just launched a competitor to AWS with SunGuard. Pretty exciting stuff. We also work with companies like If This Then That, other fun things. So we are hiring. If you are passionate about software craftsmanship, you are interested in testing, if you like pair programming, iterative development, integration, DevOps, other keywords, buzzwords, come talk to me. I'll be at the bar afterwards, or hit me up at greg@promptworks.com. And yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate it, and I'll show you that URL. Okay, I put everything up for you. It's on SlideShare right now. Should be a URL I can't see very well, but you can hit that up. And here is that sample library if you guys want to click through it. So. All right. Thanks, guys, for coming out. Meetup's not over yet. Just kidding. So the bar, ladder 15, it's 15 minutes down. So if you don't know where it is, more people know it. Others know where it is. Find someone, head over. I posted the next meetup. Seth Fargo will be speaking on DSLs. He said a lot. So yeah, please throw your trash out and put your chairs back. And thanks for coming out. Thanks so much.